As a powerlifter, whether you've had a training block that was successful,
great success,
somewhat successful, or a complete failure,
oh God, oh no,
you need to make a decision on what to do next time round. But the thing is, the choice isn't just to repeat the program or redesign one from scratch. There are always good adjustments that you can make in the right places to help you refine a block to progress better. Ultimately, good programming decisions come from good judgment, and good judgment comes from a good perspective.
Thank you for that perspective.
And to have a good perspective, you need to know where to look in the program that was executed. And that's what we're going to dive into today. And if you're new here, my name is Norman Chung, and I've spent over 12 years coaching powerlifters internationally. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at key observations in reviewing training block that matter the most, important considerations when performing block reviews, and the framework for refining programs to create better progress. So it's the end of the training block, and now we need to review it to decide how to best move forward. We can break this down into 3 steps. The first one is perspective, which is what and how we look at the situation. The second one is judgment, which is how we hypothesize what has been going on and what's the best course of action. Then finally, the third one, which is action, which is what we end up doing. So one useful tip that I actually found quite useful is to actually write some notes and thoughts at the end of each training block so that when I need to go and look back, you've got some context around the observations. So let's start with perspective. What are the key observations of training programs? So I have 7 big ones worth looking at. The first one, which is which lifts perform best. So this is about looking at how successful each lift progressed. If it is not the first time that you ran this block, you may compare the differences in peak performances between blocks, as well as how strong they were at the start of the block the second time round. Specifically, you should look at the change in estimated 1 rep maxes across the blocks. Number 2, which lifts perform worst? As your success in competition is the total, we want all 3 lifts to increase together. So this is why it's worth looking at your lagging lifts. It can be easy for you to just ignore your lagging lifts if overall you are improving. Number 3, did any of the lifts feel flat in performance? So we are looking at the stagnant trend where there's no change in relative performances, where your E1RM stay pretty steady across the block. Number 4, did any of the lifts get weaker? This means looking at whether you had downward trends in your E1RMs from any of the lifts, whether it's due to pushing too hard, understimulating, or not spreading those out quite well.
He got cooked. Adrian, you didn't go down like that, huh? He got cooked.
We'll reveal those secrets later on in this video. Number 5, what was the time to peak performance in the block? This requires looking at when you were strongest within that training block, i.e. looking at when your peak E1RM was. Remember, peak performance doesn't necessarily mean the heaviest that you've lifted. For example, performing a single at 200 kilos for an RPE 6 is way stronger than the performance of a single of 202.5 at an RPE 9. Even though 202.5 is a heavier weight, the equivalent estimated 1 rep max would be higher with the 200 at RPE 6. Number 6, program execution or inconsistencies. It's also important to acknowledge that if a lifter has been inconsistent or deviated from the program at all in any way, this may appear as skipping any accessories or sets for the main lifts,
le who, the her,
or even changing around the rest days. This is going to be important to flag up, as such inconsistencies may cause volatility in strength and fatigue. Number 7, pain and injuries that may have occurred. This will obviously create context for potential issues with performance and even training dose. One of the biggest consequences of poor management of loading and fatigue and stimulus ultimately are injuries. Obviously, not all injuries are made equal. In this situation, we're thinking more about overuse injuries like strains and tendinitis and so on. They occur if imposed stress has exceeded the threshold of the tissue tolerance. So now we know what to look at, let's dive into the important questions of how do we make sense of what we actually look at? How do we refine a block for better progress? In short, there are 4 ways a lift can respond. They are get weaker, stay stagnant, mild progress, and great progress. But why distinguish mild progress from great progress? The difference between mild and great progress comes down to whether we are satisfied or not. So if we have great progress with one of the lifts, you're unlikely going to change the program at all. As the old saying goes, if he ain't broke, don't fix it. So let's look at the scenarios. Scenario 1, successful progress but no plateau to the end. If you ran a block and the lift that you are looking at progressed really well, the safe thing to do is to do nothing and run it again. Now, if you're going to this strategy, pay attention to the strength levels at the start of the block the second time round. Did you start slightly stronger or about the same or weaker? Depending on how fatigued you or the lifter was, you may choose to deload a little longer or reduce how high the final week intensity was. The other thing worth considering is sometimes we may be holding ourselves back and deload unnecessarily. In this situation, even if you have successful progress with no plateau at the end, you may choose to elongate the mesocycle and hold that intensity for another microcycle at the end the second time round. So if you had a 4-week mesocycle, you may do a 5-week mesocycle the second time round and repeat the 4th week. Sometimes deloading too early just eliminates the optimal stimulus prematurely. If the lifter did not report any signs of fatigue, you may even consider driving up the training dose again the next time round. This would be a great way to see what the tolerance is to the training dose. And consequently, this would give you more data on the lifter's dose-response relationship. Scenario 2, successful progress but peaks early. So the second scenario is if you progress well but the strength started tanking towards the second half or towards the end. This is very likely a scenario of exposure to an overreaching stimulus. An overreaching stimulus is basically a level of training that causes short-term fatigue that leads to a downward trend in performance. This can also be defined as exceeding your maximal recoverable dose. Two options here. Your options are either to consider cutting the block length short. You do this by literally cutting off the last microcycle or two. But here's the thing. Personally, I would only do this if the mesocycle length is 5 or more weeks. The reason why I say that is that background level of fluctuating externals can distort your level of performance and fatigue across time. So if your mesocycle ends up being rather short, it can be hard to tell if there has been short or medium-term progress. Alternatively, you can consider elongating the low-intensity exposure at the start of the block if the block length is already relatively short. So how would this look like in practice? Here's an example. Let's say we executed an initial block. Week 1, 5s at RP5, week 2, 5s at RP6, week 3, 5s at RP7, and week 4, 5s at RP8. We can adjust this so that the next time round it would look like week 1, 5s at RP5, week 2, 5s at RP5 again, week 3, 5s at RP6, and week 4, 5s at RP7. So let's look at scenario 3, flat progress. Now, this isn't a good situation, but it's not a terrible situation either. Context matters here, as this can easily happen to individuals with 10 plus years of training experience. You may only end up seeing progress every few mesocycles or so. Assuming that this isn't the case, this is what you can do. First of all, we can look at the whole picture of the training block. One big question worth asking is, has the overall training dose of the program changed from preceding blocks, or what was performed considerably different to what was actually programmed, i.e. have they overshot? So in this case, training dose may mean the combination of volume and intensity. Now, were you lifting at much higher or lower intensity, etc.? If your program doesn't provide those metrics, check out my program analyzer in the description box below to help analyze your past training programs. Now, if you made better progress in previous training blocks to this and the overall training dose were different, you probably went the wrong direction with the training dose. Now, if there isn't a huge difference, then we can start to zoom in a bit more and look at the sessions and training weeks. We can break things down into two scenarios. When a lift is done with once a week frequency, and when a lift is done with twice or more per week. Now, if the lift is done once per week, your performance is flat no matter how much you dial up the training dose. It's very likely that it's time to increase the training frequency. Now, when increasing training frequency, you should always consider a low dose for the second session. Never put a huge spike in training dose for the second session. My recommendation is anywhere between 1 to 2 hard sets to begin with for the next mesocycle and see how you or the lifter responds to this. Now, if you or the lifter is training the lift twice or more per week, you need to explore to see if this fatigue issue or an understimulation issue. Now, if you're coaching someone, then it's going to require a bit more communication and collaboration to explore their experiences between the training sessions of individual lifts. Now, if the main or primary days feels fresh and recovered going into the sessions, there may be several possibilities. Now, if you or the lifter thinks that the barbell feels very heavy in the hands or the back, depending on what lift it is, there may be an intensity, microcycle split or frequency issue. I would first consider addressing the exposure of intensity of the non-primary days. This may mean increasing the peak intensity or average intensity exposure of the non-primary days. We could apply a linear periodization to those sessions. So for example, if it was previously 3 sets of 6 at RP6, you may move to 3 sets of 4 at RP6, or we can add an exposure to it. For example, going from 3 sets of 6 at RP6, but then simply adding a triple or a double into the session as a top set or a fatigue set. A top set in this case would be done first and a fatigue set would be done last. You may choose to do a fatigue set if the performance of the backup sets can get fatigued from doing a high intensity top set. If there is considerable rest days before the primary day, then it's very useful to consider the proximity of the non-primary days by moving it closer. If this isn't even the case, then it's likely that you could need to increase the training frequency. If there is a particular muscle group that feels like they're struggling more than the other prime movers, we may need to consider a more subtle program adjustment. For example, if the pecs feel very recovered but strained in the bench press, or the quads feel very jelly in the sumo deadlift, we may consider adding some accessory volume on those muscle groups on those non-primary days. As mentioned before, consider a conservative implementation of about 1 to 2 hard sets to begin to see what the response is. If it's a bit more range of motion specific, we may need to explore a change in SBD variation or addition of accessory exercises that targets the time under tension specific to that range of motion. If you or the lifter feels like performance and fatigue feels a bit flat, where you don't feel fully fresh but you also don't feel fatigued, and the load and exposure are similar on both days, what you could try and do is polarizing the exposure a little bit more. What this means is rebalancing the training dose in opposite directions. This may look like pushing the intensity a bit more on the primary days, but pulling back the intensity down a bit more on the secondary day. You may also want to consider having a bit more volume on that secondary day and less volume on the primary day if both sessions were previously not too dissimilar. Scenario 4, weaker performance. If performance is getting weaker when it has not been previously, whether it's going up or stagnant, then you apply the same level of analysis as if the strength was trending sideways. First, look at the whole program. Was there a massive change in programming? And if so, it's likely that the hypothesis leading up to the decisions was wrong. Now, if there was a considerable change in training dose, it's worth considering moving towards the opposite direction with regards to the training dose in the next block. Specifically, if any variable increased, such as volume, intensity, or both, and that led to a weaker performance, it's likely that you surpassed your maximal recoverable dose. Now, what you want to do in the next block is consider moving towards the opposite direction and reducing it. Now, if it's not obvious that the training dose has changed that drastically, you should zoom into the doses of each session and microcycle. Now, if the primary day feels overly fatigued week after week, you need to look at how the preceding training sessions doses were progressing week after week. If approaching the primary day, you're feeling this overall fatigue from hard training or systemic fatigue that's not confined to any singular muscle, or maybe it's multiple muscles, there are a few options. The less disruptive adjustment is to reduce the training dose of those preceding sessions. For a micro adjustment, you can just reduce intensity, but if you want to considerably reduce stress, you may want to consider reducing total reps as well. Alternatively, you could consider spacing the sessions out with additional rest days or simply pulling the preceding sessions back earlier. If, however, you confidently believe that the fatigue is localized to a singular muscle group, here are your options. You could modify and relocate accessory exercises to another day further back. Now, if there is already quite a high amount of stress on this muscle group on the other days, then consider reducing the volume going into this muscle group in the first place. You could consider changing accessory exercises or SBD variations depending on the situation. Let's say it's in the adductors and you are a sumo puller. You could consider substituting some of the volume for some conventional deadlifts or remaining deadlifts.
Time to be a man.
You're still going to get transference from these variations, even though they are less specific. On the other hand, if your performance is getting weaker because of training dose that is understimulating, you can run the same process as mentioned when approaching programming where performance trended sideways. So if you guys found this video really useful, all I ask for is for you guys to click the subscribe button. And in return, my commitment is to continue to produce really useful videos to help you with your powerlifting programming journey so you can continue to create better success. And as always, I'll see you guys on the next one.